Hi, folks. Jonathan Lee here, founder and CEO of Perfect SME, the company that created and owns ImplementERP.ai, the world's very best tool for managing any type of ERP project. As part of our ERP educational series, we'll cover the system selection process, which for most companies consists of both requirements gathering and the system selection itself. So we'll use the acronym RGSS. A little bit about us. We're a young tech firm, and we're absolutely fanatical about helping small to mid-sized enterprises. One of those ways is to take methodologies that are commonly used by Fortune 500 firms, then build out new technologies that enable small enterprise to use such concepts, benefit from such concepts really quickly and with relative ease. Before we get into the requirements gathering and system selection phase, remember RGSS, let's talk about the overall life cycle, both for new companies selecting their first system, as well as for existing companies that are replacing their current system, say it no longer meets their needs. They've acquired another company, they're in new markets, they sell new products or added services. They would start right about here. Let's cover some typical timeframes real quick. The requirements gathering phase, it can take as little as 2 weeks, but usually it takes more like 2 or 3 months. And that's actual delivery duration, not calendar duration. So we're talking about 4, 8, 12, sometimes even 16 weeks worth of work, depends on the complexity and the nature of the company. The system selection can be very much the same. Now, this one is never 2 weeks because it's not just about you. You have to coordinate with outside ERP companies, system implementers, aka integrators, potential other consultants. So scheduling all those different entities is a bit of a challenge. It could be as little as a month or 2 months worth of work, but it usually spans 3 or 4 or even 6 calendar months. And that's actually very, very normal. And this is a process you don't want to hurry or rush too much. Now, once the system is selected, of course, you go through the implementation. This is for smaller companies, say under 1,000 employees, about a year and a half to 2 years. Now, that's considerably shorter than it was 10 or 12 years ago, where an implementation could take 3 or 4 years for a relatively small company with a relatively simple architecture. So big changes there. And then after that, you have the waves of post-go live optimization projects. Those functionality that you left on the table, whether you had to or you wanted to, but you want to implement it later on, that's when this happens. And this duration is usually measured in years. I've personally never seen it shorter than 2 or 3 years. 5 to 10 years is very common. Today, we're going to be covering the RGSS. Okay, so we'll use this as a reference guide. And while we're referencing that lifecycle pictorial, we'll talk about the scenario in which these needs come up for most companies. Usually the company is stuck at step 0. All they know is they need a system. And the company might jump on a search engine like Google, start doing some basic research, try to identify a case study or two. And what we really admire are the very few companies that search out models or frameworks to follow. And one of the things we'll cover at the end of the presentation is how our tool has the model and the frameworks built in. So once they determine they need to get away from that step 0 mode and take their first step and move forward clarity, what does clarity look like? It means that they'll obtain some sort of architecture. They'll know what their organization is going to look like, the systems architecture as well. They'll have some sort of a future state in mind and a plan to get there. And the plan consists of the timeline, the resource loading, and of course, the cost. Now, From there, what will they achieve? So the use case being stuck at step 0, but in following all the right steps, what will they have? They'll have clarity next steps. So they'll have a structure on how to move forward. That's for each of the phases. They'll also have frameworks identified and ready to go. And as a huge benefit, and something that's really important to achieve, it's a state of avoiding chaos and risk, a way of not throwing away anything you've done or built, and then enabling the best decisions. Because obviously, in the system selection phase, decisions are ultra critical. Here's the traditional ERP requirements gathering and system selection methodology. We'll start off with the process. A consultant or consulting team will come to your organization, take observations, and start to analyze your situation, your needs, sit with your end users, facilitate meetings and sessions. If they're good, they'll talk with you about your not just your system needs, but the operations of your business that even slightly relate to your system needs. So, for example, how you do product development, or if you're challenged and constrained there, iterations for products, first article, prototypes, stuff like customer acquisition, customer retention, customer rationalization, order intake and scheduling, resource loading. Are you going to go finite or infinite when it comes to resource loading and scheduling? Jobs, first pass yield, scrap rates, everything to your agings, the performance of your agings, transaction admin costs. The more they can talk shop, the better an ERP consultant they will be for you. And this is something I personally love to do with clients, is actually really jump into their business, learn about it, and then truly understand the needs. So with those observations, the facilitated sessions, the interviews, and the observations, what do? They plug in those findings, that data, into a spreadsheet or some sort of a program that likely is a spreadsheet, but with a prettier front end interface. And that provides some sort of answer and series of recommendations that then get captured in reports that are generated, given to in various presentations and all that. Now, we're going to talk about the massive inherent flaws in this model, but I wanted to at least let you know what that traditional 20, 30 years worth of system selection projects, what they look like. All right, let's talk about the outputs and outcomes from that process. Now, here are the artifacts that are most common. First of all, it's the development and the populating of the requirements list itself. It consists of some form of required or optional label. It lists out the department that the list pertains to. Then, of course, the list itself. That is then used to generate a lot of reports, create an RFI, RFQ, or RFP. From that, or from the overall content that's been generated so far, a series of presentations, usually centered around reporting and update providing to the executive team. What are the flaws and issues? The result from the traditional RGSS model. First of all, you can pick the wrong system. That doesn't mean you picked a bad system. It might work okay, but if the information collected wasn't really comprehensive, if it wasn't well structured, you might have picked the third or fourth best system. You won't know because you didn't collect the enough information to know what the number one system would have been and why. But you can probably get along just fine, and you may never know it, but it was the wrong system. The second piece is you don't have clarity on the future state. If you think about it, all they did was say, yes, we provide that. Yes, we provide this, but not how that functionality, that feature will work specifically for you, because in the requirements gathering list, all there is later on is a do they have it or don't they label. The processes are definitely undefined because, as you saw in that spreadsheet, it's more about specific nuanced needs and not about how a transaction would work from beginning to end and modeling the requirements around that. Next, you're going to have to start all over again because the team that worked with you during the selection process from the ERP company you selected is not the same team that does the implementation. That's extremely rare. And so when they get the RFI, when they get the sales pitch, even the statement of work from the sales team, the implementation team still doesn't have nearly enough information to really understand your business. They'll just have enough information to have some sort of acclamation. So what industry you're in, how big you are, your revenues, and that generic list of your requirements. Now, the worst part of all this is, so this process you just went through with potentially the wrong system cost a lot more than a much superior model with inferior results. And that's where we come in. Our model looks nothing like that traditional one you just saw. We record our requirements around processes. So for your finance team, how do they generate reports, financial reports and statements? For the bulk of the organization, what's your order to cash look like, your quote to cash? So each of these processes are broken up into sub-processes. Under each of the sub-processes, it lists out the requirement. Now, I don't want you to think this is all there is. Within each of these boxes, there is a lot more information that is collected and used by all parties. But before I actually get into that screenshot, let me just specify one of the ways we do statusing, whether it's a requirements gathering phase, system selection phase, or an actual implementation, is look for the completed mark. When you see this box as being completed, it's saying for the requirements gathering process, we have documented everything there is to document about our needs, our requirement for a system as it relates to customer orders, as it relates to work centers. So as you get all of these boxes checked off, it basically says we now are able to provide that information back to the outside world, and we are specifying what we need for our entire order to cash, correlated to sub-process correlated to features and functionality required from a system. So going back to that earlier comment, what's in each of these boxes when you click in it? This kind of data. And it goes way down below too. It allows you to put in notes about what you need, integrations you imagine are necessary, additional requirements like security, roles, profiles, workflow. And then down below, there's a lot more information, but I just wanted to show you that top portion to give you a glimpse. In the status center, now, this is really key. If you guys have identified 10 core processes that have lots and lots of requirements associated with them or aggregated underneath them, then you're going to want to have a wide variety of views. So in this case, for example, on the procurement process called procure to pay, how many screens or forms have identified as necessary, and what's the status of those? So in procure to pay, it looks like just on this screenshot right here, I'm seeing about about 9, and 8 of those 9, the documentation of the requirements is complete. I just need to chase down whoever owns the items form, and look at that, that's me. And that way, when that is done, I can turn to the project manager or whomever and say, we have listed out all the requirements that we have for our procurement process. But there's so many other filtering criteria that you can use. So A great way for a PM to see where you are with any kind of ERP project. Again, whether it's requirements gathering, a selection, implementation, or post go live optimization, uses the same method. Finally, the beauty of having that information is you get some really cool, useful outputs. This is just one of many examples, but instead of saying that you have 69% of your tasks done on a spreadsheet and you really don't know what that means, okay? Here we say that we have 69% of the processes loaded, meaning that we have 69% of all the requirements that we know are going to be necessary for these processes to be supported by a system. And that is so much more telling than someone that just tells you what percentage of tasks are done, but it doesn't tell you how many of the requirements have been identified, what kind of additional requirements, like I said, the workflow, security, profiles, how much of that have been collected and documented, on and on. Now, what's really powerful is if you go through an entire ERP lifecycle from requirements gathering all the way through the selection, the implementation, and then the optimizations on this tool, that means all the information that you started off with is leveraged for the next phase. You might have some updates and some edits, but it's still all there for you to work off of. And it moves forward with that same data for all of these phases. And then 5 years later, 7 years later, as you determine you need a new system, you can still utilize all the data that you've collected for this ERP lifecycle and use it to then serve as a baseline for you to modify, make additions. And then that will save you a ton of time as you start the requirements gathering process all over again for that next system years down the road. All right, I hope you have enjoyed this educational video. We'd love to hear from you. Any feedback or requests, please shoot us an email at this email address. And to check us out, learn about our tool and the methodologies, please visit us at ImplementERP.ai. Thanks for your time.